For this section, we're going to look at China. China had almost no clue what was going on with the Industrial Revolution. They were more focused on their domestic front, and if they were concerned about any European power, it was Russia. They were just fine on their own, thank you very much, and kept Europeans at bay with the Canton system of trade. Remember that the Chinese had just one port that they would let the Europeans use? The British will end up strong-arming their way into Chinese trade, and this will begin what Chinese historians call China's Century of Humiliation. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, the English tried to break into the Chinese trade. In 1793, Lord George Macartney went on a mission to improve trade relations, but was rebuffed. Similar instances happened to Lord Amherst in 1816 and to Lord Napier in 1834. By this time, the British have had it. They're looking for any excuse to force their way in, and they'll get it by creating a drug problem in China. While all this is going on, these attempts to break into trade from a sort of legal standpoint, the East India Company was trying to break into trade illegally through the use of opium. Opium had been in China for centuries, but it was mostly used recreationally. Men, women, all different classes used opium. And it wasn't just about getting a high, it was actually a useful medicine in a world that lacked modern healthcare like penicillin. Opium was used to treat inflammations, malaria, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, colitis, various gastrointestinal issues, nervous disorders, and in women it was used to treat labor pains and complications from childbirth. The British introduced a new way of consuming it, by smoking it with tobacco. Huge rituals developed around smoking opium. There would be these opium dens, where the host or hostess would pack the pipes with tobacco and opium, and then scoop out the leftovers, and those would be sold or given to poor Chinese people. Kind of like getting the last bit of a cigarette. And guys, don't smoke. Tobacco is wacko. By 1800, the emperor faced a population that was abusing opium, and set about with sort of a war on drugs. He appointed a minister, sort of like an opium czar, to be in charge of inspecting all ships for illegal opium. The opium czar would board these ships and make the crews sign agreements denouncing opium. Now that was enough for Britain to have an excuse to go to war with China. In 1839, the British sent one of their first ironclad warships, the Nemesis, if you recall, to force their way into Chinese trade. Thus began the Opium War. Stay tuned, because there's gonna be a sequel. The Royal Navy pounded the eastern coast of China and left the Chinese with little choice but to seek terms. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 did a few main things, and this was a completely one-sided treaty that was rammed down the Qing Emperor's throat. The treaty forced the Chinese to pay reparations in silver, placed a fixed tariff on British imports, gave Britain increased access to Chinese markets, and created 4 additional ports for trading, including Shanghai. The treaty also gave the territory of Hong Kong to the British, a territory they would hold until 1997. I actually remember when Hong Kong was given back to China. It was a big deal. And while this doesn't get the same attention as the new ports and trade, from a cultural or psychological aspect, this final thing is huge. The treaty forced the Qing Emperor to give full diplomatic recognition of Britain. This essentially meant that the Chinese had to treat the British as equals. Whereas before, the world revolved around the emperor, now there were 2 centers of power. The Opium Wars set the stage for an internal struggle in China, known as the Taiping Rebellion. In China, anti-foreign sentiment mixed with anti-Manchu sentiment — remember the Manchu defeated the Ming Dynasty and created the Qing Dynasty — combined with the spreading opium addiction and the imbalance of trade following the forced Treaty of Nanjing, all swirled together to create the conditions for the Taiping Rebellion. The rebellion started with a man named Hong Xiuquan. Hong Xiuquan had tried over and over to pass a civil service exam. He came from a humble background, so passing the extremely difficult civil service exam would not only give him a future, but would also help his family get some economic stability. Hong Xiuquan failed the exams 4 times. That's pretty hard news to take. In his depression, he came across a religious tract. While reading it, Hong Xiuquan made a stunning personal realization. He was Jesus Christ's brother, and thus was a son of God. He believed that he was commissioned by God to found a new kingdom on earth and drive the Manchu conquerors, the Qing, out of China forever. Hong was able to convince so many people to join him, willingly and forcefully. In 1853, when the Taipings conquered Nanjing, the previous capital under the Ming dynasty, Hong Xiuquan declared himself to be the true emperor to rule over a heavenly kingdom of peace. Hong seemed to have a clear path to victory in taking over Beijing. Instead, he basically just shacked up in Nanjing and appointed a bunch of different ministers to run his conquered territory on his behalf, and just kind of peaced out. Meanwhile, the Qing were dealing with a lot on their plate. They had the Taiping Rebellion happening in the south, another Opium War to deal with, and another rebellion, the Nanjing Rebellion, to deal with. And also an incredible natural disaster due to the flooding of the Yellow River. While the British and French were preoccupied with the Crimean War, they didn't pay much attention to China. Once the war was over, though, European and American emissaries learned about the Taiping happenings. This could be a chance for them to get involved and tip the scales even further in their behalf. However, the more they learned about Hong Xiuquan's form of Christianity and that whole younger brother of Jesus thing, they were pretty much turned off. That, and the fact that the leaders were living lives of indulgence and abandon, the Europeans decided to strike their own way against the Qing. The pretense for this came when port inspectors boarded the ship the Arrow, and push comes to shove, the crew wound up dead. This was enough for the British to attack. This was essentially a second Opium War. This culminated in the sacking and burning of the Beijing Summer Palace in 1860, which was a devastating cultural blow. Imagine if someone set the Library of Congress on fire. It's kind of like that. Once they defeated the Chinese again and forced a new round of treaties again, the British and the French joined the Qing Emperor to put down both the Taiping and the Nanjing rebellions. The Nanjing Rebellion was essentially a smaller rebellion aimed at taking out the Manchu powers. They fought mostly using guerrilla tactics, but weren't fighting for any religious or economic pretense. The Nanjing Rebellion could have theoretically joined the Taiping Rebellion and presented a formidable foe to the Qing, but they did not band together at all. The Nanjing Rebellion actually went on for a few years after the Taiping Rebellion was shut down. What did them in was when the Qing Emperor sent one of his trusted General So Sung Tang, or General Zhou Zhuangtang, who defeated the Nanjing. And today he lends his name to a delicious American Chinese dish, General Tso's chicken. Nom, 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 nom. The Yellow River is one of the three primary rivers coursing through China on its way to the sea. In 1851, devastating floods caused the river to change course. This led to massive drownings, crop loss, famines, and was an environmental disaster heretofore unseen in China. The Yellow River is the cradle of Chinese civilization, and in just a few years it wiped out dozens of villages and thousands of lives. This change in the river course also inaugurated decades of water shortage along the former riverbed in the province, and many environmental historians argue that it was one of the causes of the Taiping Rebellion. Well, we call it a rebellion for the sake of our class, but what the Taiping wrought was a civil war. It was the bloodiest civil war in history. Between 20 million to 30 million people died, mostly due to starvation and disease. But it really didn't matter how they died, but that the people died in such large numbers. Even half a century later, some of the provinces were still trying to get back the population they had had before the Taiping Rebellion. The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the natural disaster compounded with economic devastation, not to mention the human toll, which basically led to the decline and fall of the Qing Empire. The Qing was no longer a conquest regime dominated by a Manchu military, but was now under the control of a group of aristocrats and military strongmen, civil governors, and a small number of foreign advisors. Without a strong central unified leadership, the Qing could not recover their powers of taxation, legislation, and military command. From the 1860s onward, China disintegrated into a number of large power zones. It's no wonder why the Chinese refer to this as the beginning of China's humiliating century. They went from being the most powerful nation on Earth to one that was propped up like Weekend at Bernie's. And I'm just gonna guess that you guys don't know what Weekend at Bernie's is. It's a movie where these two guys go to this guy's house, and he's dead, but they pretend he's still alive, and it's a 80s movie. It's really dumb. Anyway, we'll see you in the next lecture.